So, in the last few months, a couple different states have passed laws regarding abortion. Some of them, like New York State and Virginia, I don't think Virginia's laws passed, but it nearly passed laws that would basically legalize abortion at much later stages than previously. And in fact, some of them basically seem to imply abortion at any time, and even post-abortion killing, literal infanticide. There's a recording of the governor of Virginia, which again, I don't think that that law passed, but the governor of Virginia basically explicitly saying this. And there's been a reaction in those states that are more culturally conservative and more culturally opposed to abortion. Most notably Alabama, but also Missouri and a few others are likely to follow, which essentially, one of them is a so-called heartbeat law. So as soon as the fetus develops a heartbeat, that you can't abort it. Something that happens early in the first trimester, and something that would kind of probably practically outlaw abortion in most cases, since the window before a woman could understand that she was pregnant and make the decision to get aborted would be quite small. So there's been a huge amount of debate in this online, and it's a topic that I've not just online, in real life. There've been rallies, there've been all kinds of protests for and against, the acrimony, the anger. It's one of the most polarizing issues out there. It just really cuts to the heart of the culture war and to different metaphysical views of morality, ethics, and uh, it's certainly a topic that is interesting, that raises a lot of interesting questions, and it's understandable how people can get as emotional as they do. Now, I've made videos about this in the past, although it's been quite a while. Early on, I did a series on abortion. I think it was the very second series that I did after my gun control series, which was the first thing that I kind of started off on this channel way back in 2011 on. And what's interesting here is that I was coming at it very much from a libertarian perspective. Now, historically, libertarians, I think most historic libertarians, the famous writers that kind of have dominated the movement have been pro-life, excuse me, pro-choice. If you look at people like Ayn Rand or Rothbard or Mises or Milton Friedman, most of these people were not socially conservative, and most of these people were pro-choice. There may be exceptions here. I don't know about Hayek. I'm not sure about Milton. David Friedman was probably. I shouldn't have said that about Milton, because there's a good chance that they're pro-choice, but that they're pro-choice. And I always felt that the libertarian arguments, libertarian philosophy, comes down much stronger on the pro-life side of the argument. Um, the argument being quite simple, that a fetus, once conceived, is a human life, and that this is scientifically kind of the only way to classify it. I mean, we look at, people like to use these terms like globs of cells, and that's not necessarily an incorrect term. I could call anyone a glob of cells or a sack of organic material, but it's a life form without question, and we have a scientific system of categorization, of where we classify things, and it's an animal, and it belongs to the species Homo sapiens. So that being said, if you kill it, that's literally homicide. Now, that doesn't mean that abortion is necessarily wrong, because homicide is sometimes justifiable. You can kill someone in self-defense. I'm one of those people who thinks that suicide is justifiable, and then there are also instances where maybe it's not good that somebody died, but it's not necessarily anyone else's fault. If someone dies by accident, or you kill somebody by accident, and it's not because of any kind of negligence on your part, it's just a random accident, that's not something that should necessarily be considered a crime. But what's interesting is, in the popular debate on this topic, obviously you have some strong ideologues on both sides who do speak in more principled terms, but most of the debate, and this is true with other political topics that get debated, is just completely obfuscated by slogans and rhetoric. So, whereas on the pro-life side, we'll argue that it's a human life, and that you can't kill it without cause, and that just because you don't want to or whatever is not necessarily a good reason. The pro-choice side will have slogans like "My body, my choice," or "Her body, her choice," or "Get the government out of my vagina," or things along those lines, or refer to it and really refer to the fetus in the most derogatory, dismissive terms possible. It's a parasite. It's a glob of cells. it's goo. If you could step on it, you wouldn't know. And I think that the reason that's done is because grappling with what's really happening is very difficult. You are killing a life. Now, again, there are arguments that can be made in favor of abortion that admit that, but they are trickier arguments. And what's interesting is that libertarians, being the Aspergery, uh, argumentative bunch that they are, did try and grapple with it. So you have this kind of very esoteric debate among libertarians, and you have this so-called evictionist argument raised by people like Walter Block about how sure it's murder and sure it's homicide, but the fetus is committing trespass, and the woman, she does own her body, and because she owns her body, she can, quote, evict the fetus. And there's different versions of this. In some versions, the eviction is only valid if the fetus is viable and it can be saved or kept alive through artificial means, something that is, practically possible nowadays to a certain extent, and to an ever greater extent. Then there are other versions where it doesn't really matter if the fetus can be saved or not. It's her body; she can kick them out, come what may. And this kind of comes into a deeper ethical question of whether or not you can punish, if you can, what you can do if somebody commits a trespass, right? If somebody trespasses on your land, are you justified in just straight up killing them, regardless of whether they're a threat to you or not? Or is there some kind of ethical limit to what you can do, retribution, what kind of retribution you can go, or what you can do to neutralize the property invasion or the rights violation that the trespass represents? And I actually don't know that there's a clear answer on that. If It's an interesting question. If it's an added layer, if you're saying evicting somebody from your property necessarily entails their death, uh, is that then justifiable or not? I think that's a really hard question, and one that I actually don't have a great answer for. But what's interesting is this debate among libertarians was, again, something you'd see in YouTube comments or in articles from libertarian periodicals that very few people would read. And now suddenly it's getting trotted out as a strong argument from pro-choice people. They're talking about the evictionist argument. And I'm kind of curious why that is. It's always been my allegation, my sense, especially when it came to conservatives, that conservatives didn't really have much of a coherent ideology. They wanted to, quote, conserve things. Whatever existed in the past, they wanted to conserve. So before Social Security was enacted, they were against it, but now that Social Security has been around for 70 or 80 years, they want to keep it. They don't want to get rid of it. And whereas the draft was at one time a new radical thing that some conservatives opposed, once the draft was established, suddenly they became its greatest champions. Or maybe suddenly is not the right word, but within half of a generation or less, it became something that they championed. Not just on any kind of utilitarian grounds or changes in any kind of principles that they could articulate, just because it's been around, so they then support it. And most of the arguments that right-wingers have used, I feel like, are drawing on libertarian thinkers and libertarian arguments. You can't make an argument against, say, a tax increase or a government program or a war, for that matter, without delving into arguments that are either explicitly libertarian or arguments that libertarians have raised. I wouldn't have thought, and I still don't have this kind of intuition, that left-wing people would be drawing on libertarian arguments nearly as much, and yet it seems that they do. They draw on libertarian arguments when it comes to police brutality. They draw on libertarian arguments when it comes to war, or when it comes to privacy, and now they're drawing on it when it comes to pro-choice. I don't know that how many of the pro-choicers out there are aware that they're kind of parroting Walter Block or Murray Rothbard when they do it, and that doesn't necessarily mean that their arguments are any less sincere or valid or invalid because they're coming from libertarians. But I think it is pretty interesting that that's happened, and it's kind of surreal to find, something that I was debating in a very tiny YouTube channel 7 or 8 years ago is now like a mainstream issue. It was debated back then as well, but for some reason, and I think I want to go into that a little bit, the two sides, and especially the pro-choice side, so-called, were unwilling to grapple with what they were actually doing. People's moral intuition is that they're good people, and killing another human is one of the things that is the most causes the most affront to our intuitions. But as I said, people do understand that there are circumstances where killing another person, where committing a homicide is justified. Again, the most obvious one is self-defense, or it's not obvious to me, but obvious to many people in the case of war, which many people would assume is, well, self-defense or characterize it as self-defense, no matter how ridiculous that description is. Uh, and so there's an argument to be made there. There are other arguments you can make in favor of abortion as well. You can argue that it's not a person or that it's not a human. That's the other one that people like to do. So a lot of the rhetoric, again, is focused on that, to kind of diminish the status of this entity, to obfuscate what it is. And I'm receptive to that to a point. People will say, well, yes, it's a human life, but it's not a quote unquote person. And these arguments about what is and is not a person are bandied about. And I think that there is definitely a possibility to justify justify abortion by going along that route. Say, well, it's not really a person. The problem with these arguments is that the definitions that people use for person are not the same. There isn't some agreed upon consensus. There's not even anywhere close to a majority. If you ask 10 different people to give you a definition of personhood, you'll get 10 different answers. And I'm sure I'll get people in the comments who will say, no, it's pretty simple. A person is X, Y, and Z. And other people will also say, no, it's pretty simple, and they'll say it's A, B, and C. There might be some overlap here and there, but there really isn't a consensus on this. And also, whenever I have asked for people to list this, and they list the criteria for what is and what is not a person, you invariably come up with things that the birthing process is not really that major of a distinction. So if you're going to say, well, a person who doesn't pay taxes or who doesn't vote, they're not a person legally or whatever, they can't be on a jury. Well, that's true. That's certainly true of an unborn fetus. That's also true of a newborn baby, and indeed of a child of a fairly advanced age. So, people list cognitive abilities. There's not a giant IQ jump that happens after you're born. There is a very gradual sequence of upgrades with no clear line between developmentally one and another. So if we're going to say that a certain level of cognitive ability is what makes someone a person or not a person, there's no evidence that the birthing event, as significant as that is in other regards, is that significant when it comes to cognitive abilities, or the ability to take care of oneself, the ability to be independent, so-called. A newborn infant a neonate is completely helpless and completely dependent, and will be for some time, on those around them. So while these arguments can be made, they don't really strike people's intuitions as easily. It's more nuanced to say, well, it's not a person because of X, Y, and Z. So people just say it's just a glob of cells, or they just say it's my body, my choice, and completely obfuscate what's going on. And to go back to the evictionist argument, I find this really unpersuasive, not because, as I said, it's plausible to me that you'd have the right to evict somebody even if it certainly meant their death, if they're trespassing on your land or your property, period. So let's say I'm out in my yacht in the middle of the ocean or in the middle of the lake, and it turns out that there's a stowaway on my boat, somebody who snuck on my boat. Maybe they were trying to commit a crime, maybe they just wanted to go for a joyride, who knows. And obviously, if they were trying to harm me, if they were trying to attack me or whatever, I think most people would understand it's perfectly legitimate for me to throw them overboard. But even if they weren't doing that, even if they were just trying to hitch a ride, I think that there's a strong argument that I could kick them off my boat. Now, there's a counter argument that, for the trespass that they did, the crime that they committed, the rights violation that they are guilty of, that throwing them off the boat, if that means essentially their death, is not justified and is going too far. There is an argument to be made there. The problem, though, is it's not really relevant in the abortion discussion. The problem in the abortion discussion is that this isn't a case where the fetus invaded the woman's body it snuck in there, or it used its volition to surreptitiously gain entry into her uterus. Uh, it gained entry because the woman, she probably didn't have sex in order to have a child. I'd be curious to know how many abortions are committed by women who were looking to get pregnant. My guess is not many. Probably can happen, but it's probably rare. Um, but even if that wasn't the intention, it was a different intentional act that just accidentally resulted in this fetus being trapped inside her womb that led to the pregnancy. So a woman is just having sex for recreation or for casual reasons. She's not intending to get pregnant, but she does. That is not the fetus's fault. It would be a totally different scenario, to go back to the boat scenario, if I abducted either on purpose or accidentally somebody and placed them on my boat and then took them to the middle of the ocean. And they said, "Oh, you're trespassing on my boat." Well, they didn't actually trespass. I kidnapped them, whether intentionally or not. And since I am morally responsible for their condition, for them being present here, I can't blame them for that. And you cannot blame a fetus for the actions of its parents. And I would include the father here as well as the mother. I think that they're both liable to the upbringing of that fetus, up to a point anyway, not a point that's without limit, but to a point. And a woman can't just pretend, and I say woman here, but it's also true of a man, that, well, I didn't intend it to happen, so I'm not responsible and I can kick it out. No, you took a risk that it would happen. This is, again, very similar if I were to jump in my car and go run some errands in town. And when I'm doing that, I'm not going out with the intention of harming anybody. It's not my goal to cause an accident. It's not my goal to hurt anyone. I just want to go and run my errands. And so I jump in my car, and then I accidentally hit somebody, a pedestrian. And it's not their fault. Let's say the pedestrian didn't do anything wrong and I'm at fault. Like, am I liable to take care of that person? Let's say they go on life support, and they're going to have to be on life support for some arbitrary amount of time, say 9 months. Do I owe them restitution? Am I liable to support them during that period? And I would say that the answer is yes, and that for me to defend myself and say, "Oh, I didn't mean to hit them. I was trying to go out and just run some errands or have some fun. I just wanted to go to a baseball game or something, and it just happened that I hit them on accident. That wasn't my intention. So I have no responsibility whatsoever, and I don't want to pay for this. And so just turn off the life support because I just don't want to deal with this right now. It's not a good time in my life." And they are basically a parasite on my finances at this point, so just turn them off. No, of course not. And I think that this is analogous for the case of the woman in all cases except for rape. In cases of rape, then the woman didn't even do anything in terms of risking a pregnancy. She was just forced to. But even in that case, it's not the fetus that committed the crime. It's the rapist, and the rapist is the one who should be held accountable. And again, I think that the pro-life people are a lot more clear on these issues because I think that their intuition is much closer to the normal intuitions of most people. For instance, you can see this whenever people say, "Oh, what about," or the exception when a woman's life is in danger. I don't know anyone who's pro-life, and maybe someone can point me out an example, so maybe they do exist, but they're quite rare that I've never encountered them, who thinks that if it comes down to a medical necessity of either terminating the pregnancy through an abortion, and there's other ways to terminate pregnancies besides abortion, but the only way to terminate it is through abortion and the woman's life, I think most pro-life people, in fact all of them that I've ever encountered, would say, "Hey, if we have to make the choice, we'll save the woman," assuming that the woman doesn't chime in and say, "No, save my baby and not me." And that's because they recognize that, well, while it is a homicide, in certain situations, homicides might be justifiable. Now, that is not a normal situation. Self-defense is not a super common situation, but it's one that arises in real life and that we can document it happening. It's not exactly what you would call a lifeboat scenario. A scenario where two people's lives are in jeopardy and you have to make a medical decision to save one or the other. And the other examples of this that we know about would be something like Siamese twins, or conjoined twins rather, who are together, and that the only way to surgically separate them is to risk the death of one. That would be the only kind of, well, not the only, but one of the analogous situations to this. But pro-life people, I think, understand this, and I've never heard anything say, "No, absolutely should never you should never terminate the pregnancy through an abortion. And again, many times pregnancies can be terminated without an abortion. Uh, but they seem to understand this, and there's no question that, yeah, there should be a medical exception for the life of the mother. Now, all these laws that have happened, and famously Bill Clinton said, he would sign any anti-abortion laws as long as it had an exception for the quote health of the woman, health defined in such a way as to mean anything. And you know, we have examples of women having abortions for the very most flippant of reasons. They don't want to look fat, they just don't have the time, blah blah blah. These are not grounds for a justifiable homicide, right? You don't want to look fat in your prom photo is not justification for committing what amounts to an infanticide. It's literally a homicide. Your life isn't in danger in that case. And I think that one of the reasons there's so much acrimony on the part of the pro-choice people, that why they get so animated and angry about it, is that there's a sense of, there's an understanding that they may be in the moral wrong here. I think this was similar with slavery. I think a lot of slave owners were very vehement about the ethical greatness of slavery, because they were vulnerable to the realization that this might not be a good idea. Now, that doesn't mean that they all secretly admitted that to themselves. Some did, most probably didn't, and that's probably just as true with the pro-abortion people. But I think that's at play here. Now, this isn't to say that pro-life people aren't hypocrites or aren't wrong about a whole bunch of other things. Another real common thing I hear is people say you can't be pro-life unless you support this grab basket of all these other claims. You have to be for, free birth control and sex education and universal health care, and basically a grab bag of whatever other policies the person wants. And well, it might be true that some of those issues would be ones that a pro-life person, if they're going to be consistent, may or may not agree with. Pointing out that there may be hypocritical in their or have contradictions in their political philosophy is not actually an argument against their position on whether or not abortion should be allowed or not, or in what cases it should be allowed, rather. Just imagine if we were to apply this standard to murder. If you were to say, I don't think that murder or rape should be outlawed unless there's going to be, classes dedicated to teaching against toxic masculinity and free college education and jobs works programs and whatever other grab bag list of policies I think could plausibly be related to causing crime or not. Nobody would say that we should only outlaw murder or rape or theft if we include all these other provisions in there. And that is exactly the same. They're very similar to with them saying, well, you can't be pro-life and pro-war. I am anti-war myself, and I see the contradictions there. But that doesn't make you wrong about abortion because you're wrong about what's, say, happening in Yemen. It's also interesting, too, the degree of how the overlap between people who are pro-choice and people who are like vegans and for animal rights and for PETA, who probably oppose self-defensive homicide, right? Many of these people are strongly anti-gun, and they're like, oh, you shouldn't kill animals, you shouldn't eat burgers, you shouldn't treat your dog bad, and you shouldn't shoot a murderer who is trying to kill you, but you should be able to kill your unborn baby for any reason whatsoever. And some of them, the vitriol, I saw one post where someone posted a picture of a fetus that was it had to be very early, probably in the first, I'd say, month or two. So it looked like, it's got the fetus shape, so you recognize it as human, but I don't know, it could have been a different type of animal, maybe. Probably about the size of, your thumb. But it still had a face with eyes, and one of the commenters I would stamp on it and crush it until it didn't look like anything. Now maybe that was actually a pro-life troller, I don't know, but I've seen that kind of vitriol displayed many times, and I feel like any kind of dispassionate analysis of the topic would show that it's a human life and you need to have a good reason if you're going to kill it, and there are radical implications about that. but just giving people the ability to alleviate their circumstances by ending a human life is raising huge ethical questions, and then also just raises the prospect of really bad moral hazard, and that's something that we have been dealing with. So again, it is an interesting topic. There are interesting ways to look at it. There are arguments that can be made, right? If someone could make a really persuasive argument about personhood and how, nope, I mean, yes, it's a fetal human, but at this point, it's there's no there. It's not ensouled, if you want to say that. And so aborting it at that point is acceptable. Yeah, I would listen to that. I would like to hear that. They're all there. There are, of course, in the case of rape, and this is the other thing I really hate about people say, what about rape? What about incest? The people who advocate, it's always a red herring, because the people who say that favor abortion in all cases up to a certain point, including up to the point of birth, whether or not rape was involved, whether or not incest was involved. So, those are their own ethical situations that should be wrestled with, that should be dealt with individually, but then to generalize that to all abortions is just completely erroneous and uncalled for. So anyway, this is a debate that's not going to go away anytime soon. I think there's a hope on the part of the states that some of these laws with the new composition of the Supreme Court will become legalized. I don't particularly think that's that likely, but it's not impossible. It is interesting that the Supreme Court never thought that there was a right to abortion until 1973. One of those things that the Supreme Court just invents, and then we're all expected to find that to be authoritative and convincing without any other, on no other basis than the Supreme Court said so, which I just think is a joke. But I mean, you can just imagine all these people say Roe v. Wade, Roe v. Wade, Roe v. Wade. So let's say that these laws get validated as constitutional and abortion is basically banned in the United States. Would these same people go, well, that's it. I was wrong. Abortion is actually unconstitutional. My bad. No, they believe in what they believe based on their own ethics and moral code and the dictates of a couple of government bureaucrats who are appointed for explicitly, overtly, and undeniably political reasons are not the be-all and end-all of ethics, morality, and law. I mean, at least they shouldn't be. So anyway, that's it for now, and I'll talk to you all another day. All right, bye-bye.